Pivot now to a civil trial out of Florida, where a family is suing a hospital for actions that they say led to a mother's suicide. So it's sort of kind of a wrongful death case in the civil arena. The Kowalski family files this lawsuit against Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital. They're claiming they need about $220 million in damages after Maya Kowalski was hospitalized back in 2016. She suffers from this very rare, very painful condition known as complex regional pain syndrome. I've used this example before, but they say the pain can be as intense as like cutting off your finger without any sort of anesthetic. So on this day, she has a relapse. She's rushed to the hospital's emergency room, and they're trying to treat her as she's been treated. Her mother, Beata Kowalski, they think is interfering with her treatment. And so they complain, and there's this child abuse allegation, primarily because they're using ketamine infusions, a treatment she had received under prior medical supervision, and it seemed to be working, but now the mother's forcing this, they believe, on the hospital staff. They're concerned. They report Beata to the child abuse hotline. An investigation ensues, and then Beata is not allowed to see her own daughter during that time. 87 days of that separation, and Beata Kowalski is found hanged in their garage in their home. She kills herself. Meanwhile, Maya's father, Jack Kowalski, he alleges that the hospital's treatment and accusations of child abuse caused Beata's death. So the hospital stands by its defense that they followed all the legally required protocols and procedures. The family story is the subject of a Netflix documentary called Take Care of Maya. Earlier today, and this thing is winding down, the jury should have this case end of next week, first part of the following. Earlier today, the jury was able to hear testimony from a pediatric neuropsychological expert. So let's take a listen to some of that testimony.
You noted that she was putting together a scrapbook. Why was that significant to you?
That was significant because she had often complained of weakness in her hands and not being able to do those types of tasks.
Did that represent improvement to you?
Yes, it did.
You have a conversation in the next sentence about Maya raising concerns about not going to school. What was your response to that?
I told her that she would be able to return to school because of her progress.
You noted that Maya was open in discussing family dynamics. Let me ask you a question about that. Is your discussion of family dynamics something that you typically do with children who are undergoing psychological care for rehabilitation?
Yes.
And why is that?
Because a lot of times there's family dynamics that are contributing to the current presentation.
What did Maya tell you when discussing the family dynamics?
That she wanted to spend more time with Mom, and Mom was working a lot.
A little later down in the note, it looks like you had a conversation with Mrs. Kowalski about conversion disorder.
Yes.
And what was her response?
That she did not agree with the diagnosis.
Do you remember anything further about that conversation that you had with Mrs. Kowalski?
I don't.
And then at the end of your note, you documented a difference in Maya's reaction when you were there and when you left. Is that true?
Correct.
And how were you able to make those observations?
How was I able to make them?
Yeah, so just describe how that happens in general. If you...
So when we were talking about going home, and Maya was very upset, and when this happened, we were all trying to ignore her behavior. And she was continuing to cry, but when I went up to leave, her behavior stopped immediately.
So one of the many physicians who saw, treated, consulted on the Maya Kowalski case is presenting to this jury, and it's a lot. It's a lot. Catherine Lizardo's here, Philip DeBay. Philip, put this testimony in context for us in this defense case.
Well, I think what this neuropsych is trying to show the jury, is that her symptoms were not always necessarily consistent with somebody who had CRPS. Remember, their defense right now is that they acted in good faith, the hospital and the medical staff and the social workers, by reporting what they perceived to be abuse to the Child Protective Hotline. And that is their defense. And if the jury finds that what they did was in fact in good faith, they don't have to have been correct. They don't have to have been 100% accurate in their assessment, but they had to have reasonably suspected abuse and that they reported it in good faith. And I think what this neuropsych does is looks for other kind of symptoms, presentations in the child to suggest that what the hospital staff perceived and reported was reasonable under the circumstances, and that it wasn't so far afield and such a stretch to say that they were abusive to this child, and now the hospital should be held financially accountable to the family for this. So she's an important doctor, I think.
Yeah, and sometimes it's hard to get, you get lost in the shuffle of all these different witnesses. Remember, this is the defense case trying to say, hey, we did what we should have done, and we can't be responsible financially for what happened to this mother. So hang on, Catherine. Let's listen now to the plaintiff's cross-examination. We'll talk on the other side.
Are we correct that you met Maya and or her parents for 5 hours plus over 2 weeks?
If that's what it says in the chart, yes, that's correct.
Not a memory test. I was just wondering, does that sound about like what you were doing?
That, sure.
Okay. Now, would you agree with me that it's not exactly rare for a child, a 9-year-old girl in this case, to want to spend more time with her mother?
Yes.
That's pretty common, isn't it?
Correct.
And it would not be unusual for a 9-year-old child to be more expressive about their pain, their emotions, how they're feeling with a parent as opposed to a stranger.
Not necessarily, no.
I see. So you do not agree that children tend to open up more to their parents than they do to someone they don't know well at all?
No, I don't agree with that.
So if she went into Johns Hopkins All Children's for the visit in question here, that would be 14 months before? She went in October of 2016.
Oh, you mean, and she was in Tampa General 14 months before?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. And throughout the time that you dealt with the Kowalskis, they were cooperative. Not Maya, but Jack and Beata.
Correct.
And they were accepting of your diagnoses for the most part, were they not?
Mom had trouble accepting the diagnosis.
Initially, she agreed, and then she came back and said, I'm concerned this may not be correct, right?
Correct.
So, as far as you saw, they were perfectly normal, concerned parents.
Again, I don't like to use the word normal, but they did seem to be concerned, yes.
So interesting discussion there. Again, plaintiff's counsel cross-examining the hospital defense witness here, suggesting that the child might be more open to the parent than to a professional or somebody the child knew less. Obviously, the guy doesn't know teenagers. This young lady was a little younger than that, but you show me a teenager who's going to open up more to a parent than an unconnected family. I don't know. I want to see that teenager. Anyway, Catherine, I digress. So what do you think about, Phil mentioned this, the nature of this witness and the importance for the hospital. I always think about how long this went on, and maybe the court was an unwitting participant in keeping this problem alive for 87 days. But does a witness like this support the hospital's position?
They are trying to use this expert in support of them, but that might backfire. I haven't seen the whole cross-examination of the plaintiffs, but I think if they ask two critical questions, which is one, are you familiar with CRPS? Because we've heard testimony from a lot of the other doctors and nurses who treated Maya at that time that they actually admitted that they were not familiar with CRPS because it is a condition that not a lot of doctors and nurses are familiar with. And then the second question I'd ask is, do you know that it is called the suicide disease? Because she is a neuropsychologist, that would be within her expert preview. And as that intensified type of disease that that would validate the families, the parents' grave concern as to Maya.
So, Philip, as I look at this bigger picture, as we're winding this case down, you have the sympathies for the plaintiff that are perhaps overwhelming. And then on the defense side, you're basically saying we did everything we should have done. The court reinforced that we were doing the right thing. I don't know that that's enough to get the hospital off the hook, to basically say we just did what we were supposed to. It's almost like it's a bit of a blind eye approach. Like, we followed the rules. We did A, B, C, and D, and we can't help what happened to Beata as a result. Or Beata.
Exactly. That is correct. And in my opinion, I think the court order from the dependency court should have immunized that hospital from any liability. Now, having said that, even though, in my opinion anyway, the hospital acted in good faith when they reported this to the child abuse hotline, the problem, I think, for the defense is how a lot of the treating doctors and social workers come off to the jury. Sometimes when you don't have that bedside manner, even on the stand to a jury, you can come off looking like a cross between Marquis de Sade and Nurse Ratched on steroids. And if you come off that way to a jury now in trial, imagine how it must have come off to Maya at the time she was hospitalized. They probably thought that this girl was imprisoned in a dungeon being treated by a bunch of sadistic medical staffers. That's how it's coming off, even though legally what they probably did was in good faith and was supported by reasonable suspicion that there was abuse. Because remember, Michael, all the experts have said that CPRS is extraordinarily rare in children. It's not like the sniffles or, a broken bone or something that you treat daily. It is so rare. And even at a children's hospital that's dedicated to treating kids exclusively, they don't see it very often. So the pattern of her symptomatology presented to all the staff, including the social workers, as a kid who was being abused. And the question for the jury should be, in closing, what would have happened if the hospital failed to report this? In Florida, it's a felony. If you, as a mandated reporter, fail to report any abuse, it carries 5 years in prison.
And I think, Philip, that's why the default position really is, I got to make the report. I just think that over time, after days, after weeks, after months, it starts to look bad. And you mentioned Nurse Ratched-esque type characters, and I think of Kathy Beatty, who was the social worker in the hospital. She didn't come off so pretty good, and she got out of the case during jury selection. I think of Dr. Smith, also not coming off very good in front of this jury. So they're getting closer to a decision. And of course, we will continue to follow the Kowalski case. It is a civil case. We're talking huge money up for grabs here. If causation is proven, liability is proven, damages would flow, who knows?